Hi, I'm Brandon Schneider with the Berkeley Center for the Study of Religion. We're here today to ask 5 questions of Jason Klocek, a past BCSR summer grantee who just finished his PhD in political science at Berkeley, completing a dissertation entitled The Cult of Coercion, Religion and Strategic Culture in British Counterinsurgency. 5 questions is a playful nod to 5 years of BCSR programming and is intended as a relatively informal way to get a better idea of the people and the activities that make up the BCSR community. Jason, thank you for being here.
It's a real pleasure to be with you. Thank you for having me.
So, like I said, you just finished your dissertation. You're headed to Notre Dame. Very exciting time in a young scholar's life. But before we get to that, could we take a step back and could you tell us how you got here? How and why Berkeley? Why political science? Professionally and personally, what brought you to this point?
Sure, I think it's the perfect place to start. In some way, I'm going full circle with the postdoc at Notre Dame because I did my undergrad there. And it was there that I first sort of fell in love with the idea of learning about and experiencing various religious traditions. I was particularly lucky to have a mentor there named David Burrell, who's a well-known and respected theologian, but was also extremely pastoral in his relationship with students and guiding students to ask and explore interesting questions. And so it was really a class I took with him and then travel in the Mediterranean, where he introduced me to a synagogue in Crete called Etz Chaim Synagogue, which I eventually spent time in. It is the only synagogue on the island. It was rebuilt in the early 2000s. It's sort of become this place for interfaith dialogue and also the preservation of Greek, particularly Cretan Jewry, which is a very obscure topic.
Okay.
But it was really the time there that got me interested in religion as a social force, and then also religious violence, which I got to see firsthand there on a small scale, in that there was a fair bit of anti-Semitism still in Greece generally and on Crete. And shortly after I left the synagogue that they became wrapped up in this series of arson attacks that kind of swept through Europe around that time as well, in which there were various synagogues that had either burnt down or graffitied. And so that's a long way of saying, I was fascinated by religion from an early period, but it was the experiencing of it, both the lived tradition and the discrimination and violence that got me thinking about it.
And did you have any previous connection to Crete or
I had
any of this?
No previous connection. I was studying abroad in Greece. My dream had been to go to Jerusalem. This will date me a little, but because of what was at the time the most recent wave of violence there, Notre Dame canceled their program. And so David had directed me sort of towards this program in Greece that he knew people and knew it was an interesting program and a place where it had specifically an undergraduate component to study religion in the Mediterranean region. And so I sort of stumbled upon the synagogue through David and fell in love. It was a fascinating place where you had people from many different faiths passing through, but it was also an anomaly in terms of some Jewish traditions as well. It's a synagogue with a cemetery, which is very rare because of particular laws. Anytime a Cohen came in, we had to warn them. There was a cemetery. And then the person who ran it, Nikos Stavroulakis, he was a well-known historian of Greek and Cretan Jewry. So it was sort of an intellectual community in the strangest of places.
And did this lead to your MA at Georgetown?
So it led to Peace Corps in the Turkmenistan. So I got the travel bug. And so even though I was interested in questions about religion and religious violence, and this says a little bit how I ended up in political science, at the time I had no idea what discipline or which discipline I could best answer those questions. I had never taken a political science course.
Really?
Until the MA. So political science was not on the table, but travel was. And I went to Turkmenistan. And it was in Turkmenistan that I continued to explore particularly religion and religious minorities. I lived in one of the more diverse towns at the time, which still had different ethnic groups from Russian and Azeri and Armenian and Uzbek and Turkmen, but also religious groups. So there were also Shiite groups with secret mosques. They were hidden mosques. And I also came to know a Catholic community there that operated an underground church.
Wow.
So the Catholic community was allowed to have an embassy because of the Vatican and diplomacy. So it had a nuniciature, is what it was called, but they also did masses.
Wow.
And so that continued my interest in religion, particularly looking at religious discrimination in that country. And then I actually went back to Crete after the Peace Corps and really started thinking about which direction I wanted to go. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized religion and conflict, partially because of what was going on in the world, that was my interest. And I started searching for what I thought, my approach was the discipline that would give me the tools to address those questions. And again, because of current events, political science was the discipline that was starting to tackle contemporary religious conflict. As much as I appreciate my mentors, they were much more historically oriented. Nikos in Crete was a scholar of Ottoman history. So I sort of moved in that direction, did a master's at Georgetown, and then came to Berkeley.
Okay. Before we dive into your work at Berkeley, your dissertation, one quick question kind of in the background. You have this really fascinating experiences abroad. But back home, where did you grow up, and did you have any exposure to any of this religious conflict or religious tensions, etc.?
So I grew up in a small coal mining town in western Pennsylvania. It was a pretty boring suburban childhood, and I was raised Catholic. And so I think I had, I think the benefit I had in growing up, particularly in sort of a lower socioeconomic family, was that religion was always something lived for us. We didn't spend long periods of time discussing Catholic doctrine, but we did spend a lot of time living and thinking about how religious or Catholic teaching applied to our lives and that of our neighbors. And so religion was always a part of my life, but it really wasn't until I went away to Notre Dame that I started thinking about it systematically, sort of in the background. Which again I think does play into my research. I think of religion as something that's always in the background, even if it's not causing conflict.
It's there.
And so that's shaped a lot of how I approach it in political science, where we are obsessed with causes of things. And it's one reason I think my discipline has resisted studying religion. But as soon as you think of religion as a background condition rather than a cause, you realize it's influencing things in many varied ways.
So it sounds like a good segue to come to our second question. Your work at Berkeley, it sounds, in a sense, you've come full circle from, let's say, a very practical experience of religion in your youth, more international exposure to different religious climates, different religious conflict, more philosophical, intellectual look at religion in your undergrad and MA. And then you arrive at Berkeley for your PhD here. Could you walk us quickly through your PhD work, and then maybe give us a quick summary of your dissertation, the key points, where it fits into the wider research?
Sure. That's a better summary of my journey than I gave. That's great. So when I was looking at graduate schools, religion was, again, new on the agenda in political science. There weren't many programs that many universities that yet had institutes like the Berkeley Center for the Study of Religion, and that have now developed at other universities. So I looked for faculty. I looked at who was publishing and researching on religion and conflict, and who seemed particularly invested in it, because there was obviously a uptick in research after 9/11. And there are some people who published shortly after that who've never published on religion again. And they made a useful contribution, but it was clear it wasn't their main focus. So the attraction at Berkeley was Ron Hassner, who not just in what he was publishing, but also his personal correspondence when I applied and when I visited, made it clear that this was his area. This is what he would be studying for at least 10 years. His next project was still on religion. And I think we shared a lot of ideas about how religion influences social and political behavior. So when I got to Berkeley, though, he gave really good advice, which was first learn everything you can about political science.
Really?
Then if you want to do religion in political science, to convince our colleagues that you sort of have a place at the table, first show them that you kind of know the materialist side of political science. At the same time, he did encourage me to take classes outside our department.
Sure.
And that was helpful. It also helped that I had done a master's at Georgetown, where I took a lot of classes on religion. For example, with Jose Casanova, great sociologist of religion, right? Happened to be there. So I spent the first couple of years really focusing on political science, particularly since I was newish to the discipline, starting to branch out and make contacts in other departments, going to talks. And then that really helped me develop the dissertation project, which looks at how states respond to religious insurgencies. It's a project not about how religion fuels conflict. It's actually not a project even on a scholarly definition of religion or religion per se. I'm interested, and this is where I think the political science background helped, I'm really interested in how decision makers perceive opponents that draw on religion.
Okay, let me intervene real quick just to give you credit and some publicity. The title of your dissertation, The Cult of Coercion, Religion and Strategic Culture in British Counterinsurgency. So maybe you could also give us a little background on the title and why Britain, and what do you find in terms of the strategic culture, counterinsurgency, and how they interact with religion?
Great, yeah. I need to learn publicity.
Hey.
So the title came last.
Of course.
With all dissertations.
Yes.
The dissertation did start, so the original idea for my research was to look at how religion did influence the behavior of rebels and insurgents. And as I researched it, quickly became overwhelmed by just how many people focused on that. And it still is a valuable contribution, but with a dissertation, you kind of want to make people look a different direction. Sure. And so that's where I decided to look, instead of how religion motivates rebels, how perceptions of religion influence decision making, and I stumbled upon these British cases in a way.
Elaborate, please.
Again, because I'm interested in contemporary conflict and I'd like my work to speak to what's happening today. I started with contemporary cases, thought about going to the Philippines and other places where conflict had been going on for decades, and so at least people would be willing to talk. There might be some information, but even that information, because the conflict is ongoing, is well guarded. And it was more out of despair, right? A round of failed grants, that I started to think more broadly. I was talking to Ron, and he mentioned Cyprus sort of offhanded during a meeting, and so I started looking at it more. Of course, this now turns out to be the conflict that is one of, I think, the most interesting in the dissertation, because it's an insurgency in which the Archbishop of the Cypriot Orthodox Church founds and funds the movement, helps organize it, but I didn't know that at the time. But as I read more into these cases, I said, well, what else is going on around this time? With sort of the methodology in the back of my head that it's nice to have a set of cases that happen around the same time in the same government. And then it turns out, right, in the late 40s, there's a Jewish insurgency in mandatory Palestine, involves secular, most of the time you read about it, you hear about secular Zionists, but there's a small religious Zionist group that also participated. And then I started looking at Kenya, which happens at the same time, the Mau Mau uprising, which again, a lot of people, when you read about it, focus on the ethnic side. But there's an overlap with ethnicity and religion. And when I went into the archives, there was a clear connection for the British. So there are cases that I stumbled upon and said, wow, I really like reading about these cases. And isn't it great that methodologically it helps, that they're all happening around the same time, same government, same military force. And in fact, for example, the governor of Cyprus also advises on the Kenya emergency. So when I want to look at how these decision makers are evaluating the conflicts, I'm not looking at just sort of random people or ad hoc. I'm looking at sort of a community, so what ends up being a security community, and that's why I focus on strategic culture. Strategic cultures are these sets of ideas and beliefs that militaries and political decision makers hold that can influence the way they see violence.
Okay, so let me ask a somewhat naive question. Maybe you can help walk us through it. The cult of coercion. Is the cult there these decision makers, the strategic culture?
Yeah. So it's a play on an international relations concept, the cult of the offensive.
Okay.
Which is a study by a Berkeley PhD in the 80s, and then others have looked at it. But it's this idea that during the World Wars, that there was a heavy emphasis on an interstate conflict to favor offensive versus defensive. And it became a whole theory in international relations about you could predict the likelihood of war in any given time period based on whether offensive weapons or defensive weapons were more prominent. Okay. But for me, what I was interested in is this convergence. When I started thinking theoretically, well, first I had to think about, well, how do decision makers evaluate the religious dynamics of their opponents? Do they? Some people would say they don't, if you look at the American context in Iraq, but they do. There's in other cases. And then when they do, how does that influence them? And what I was seeing and what I developed as a theory is that this idea that it predisposes them towards coercion rather than negotiation. Okay. Because the big puzzle in the dissertation in the end is looking at why religious conflicts are so intractable. And the argument here is that state decision makers also play a role in the protracted nature of these conflicts. It's not just insurgents. So the cult of the coercion is a nod towards this idea that decision makers, because of the way they interpret the motivations of their opponents, choose to favor coercion rather than negotiated settlements.
Okay, that sounds like a great, I'm abusing this term, but another segue to our third question. Your work in general seems to lend itself very much to policy analysis, policy making, etc., whether it's in a ministry, on the ground somewhere. Mm-hmm. Do you see a role for your work and perhaps for you in the future in policy making, policy shaping? Do you see any present conflicts or situations where your ideas are really relevant or could have an impact?
Mm-hmm. Certainly. That was the initial motivation for the project, to think about intractable conflicts today. Again, I mentioned the Philippines, the fact that this has been going on since the early 70s, right? And while it's not exclusively a religious conflict, it's a conflict that has religious elements, and it's in fact those groups that are today that have drawn on religion the most that continue to fight. So the motivation for the project was about contemporary conflicts, and I think the lessons that you can draw from these historical cases can be applied in the contemporary context. So in particular, I'm interested in how decision makers, if they have, I suggest in the project they have a bias when they're looking at these religious groups. So the logical question is, how can you correct for that bias? And a lot of the current literature that tries to advise militaries or suggests what militaries can do fighting anywhere from Syria to West Africa to the Philippines is that they need more information about these groups, that militaries fundamentally are secular security communities, and they just don't look at religion, and if they look at it, they don't understand it. And I sort of I try to advance that second part of the argument, that what the big policy recommendation from my study is that militaries don't simply need more information, but they need a better way of analyzing it well, a way that allows them to be conscious of their biases. Because in the end, my argument is that these groups are influenced by non-rational elements. And so they need to have mechanisms in place that allow them to ask questions such as, is the data I'm getting on this religious group just confirming what I already believe? Sure. Something called confirmation bias in psychology, right? And so in the end, it's not more information is necessarily better, but it's more information that can be analyzed through this a less biased lens. Okay. Otherwise, these groups the militaries will keep, they will sort of enter into a self-fulfilling prophecy where we are fighting a group in West Africa or the Middle East, and we say they refuse to compromise, they might refuse to compromise because we have not given them the opportunity. So I think the catchphrase policy-wise is that it's not that religious insurgents are necessarily uncompromising. It's that they can't credibly do so with Western governments.
Okay. So I'm clearly not an expert on this material, but I find it very interesting. In reading through some of your working, maybe the abstracts and summaries of some of your working papers, the dissertation itself, which we'll post your website online so people can go visit and check that out. Two ideas that seemed of note to me. I think in some of your work you note that the kind of secular religious binary seems to be false or is in somewhat misleading when we're dealing with counterinsurgency, and also your work on rebel group fragmentation, at least as a non-expert, struck me as very interesting and counterintuitive in some ways. So maybe could you elaborate briefly on these kind of two ideas of perhaps the false binary of the secular military versus religious insurgents, and also your work, comment briefly on your work on rebel group fragmentation.
Great, yeah. So these questions, I think, get at what hopefully will develop into a broader research agenda. And what ties a lot of my work together on religious violence is looking at trying to move away from stereotypical views of religion, particularly in conflict settings. So to take the second topic first, because I think it's a clear illustration, is that there are a lot of the initial studies in political science on religion and conflict tested ideas that we thought might be true and did find some confirmatory evidence. So for example, religion may make conflicts longer because people are more invested or they're looking for rewards in the afterlife. That religious conflicts can be more lethal because people are desensitized or can use religious justifications for committing more violence. So a lot of the early studies confirm this general relationship, though the explanations I've just given are not tested. Okay. Right? So we don't really know if it's religious conflicts are more lethal because insurgents are willing to use more violence, or as my dissertation might suggest, because states use more violence. And so a lot of my research is trying to get people to think more broadly about religion and out of these sort of, for lack of a better word, more stereotypical views. So on fragmentation, there's a large literature developing on what helps rebel groups be cohesive or not, and people look towards ideologies, and so people have been writing recently about how religion binds groups together. And I think this goes back to the initial conversation, or where we started the conversation, this idea of thinking of religion broadly and lived religion. I can think of lots of religious communities that bicker and fight. And one of my favorite, there's a whole book on schisms in religion that came out a few years ago, and it was the ice cream social. This particular church, ice cream was supposed to be served before or after the service, and this led to, right? So I'm very interested in rather than thinking about religion as this cohesive element, at least imagining what might be divisive about it within rebel groups. Because rebel groups are just ordinary people who take up arms, right? So that's a working paper, and that's a more quantitative approach. The dissertation is more qualitative, in which I at least have some preliminary evidence to suggest that they are more likely to splinter, and I think that's because of maybe a rather stereotypical answer, which is that insurgents are fighting over goals that they see as particularly important, what we sometimes call in the literature as indivisible, so they cannot be divided without losing their value. So if you really believe in your goal, you might be upset when your leader goes and starts to compromise on it. So it carries this idea too, I think across my research, it's that some people within a religious insurgency might be willing to compromise. So that paper looks at an unintended consequence of it. And then more broadly, I think just the, I'm certainly not the first to suggest this secular religion dichotomy is not helpful. And that's really where I think branching outside of political science has helped. And a lot of great talks at the Berkeley Center for the Study of Religion and other conferences that I've gone to. It also helped being at Georgetown, where people were writing on this as well, which again is sort of thinking more broadly. And I think in the end, the dissertation contributes to this much larger research project by there's a debate right now in the social sciences about whether you can really define religion and study it, or whether you should abandon the concept at all.
Okay.
And the secular religion debate sometimes suggests, particularly amongst critical theorists, that you should abandon the concept. I'm trying to find this middle ground where I say that you could look at how particular actors define religion at a particular time and study the consequences. And that was really inspired by people like William Kavanaugh, who's written about the myth of religious violence. I think in the end it just shows how good research on religion in any discipline has to look across fields. And
be interdisciplinary.
Right.
Okay. Yeah. So again, a great segue to our fourth question. This is a two-parter, or two parallels, let's say. Very simply, what's next for you? What's your next project? What will you be up to at Notre Dame? And more broadly, what do you see happening in religious studies in, let's say, in the next 10 years? Trends you see emerging, opportunities, problems, etc. And just to make sure that we get this out there, you're headed to Notre Dame. You're a 2018-2020 Global Religion Research Initiative Postdoctoral Fellow. So what will you be doing at Notre Dame?
First, I need to ask for a shorter title.
Okay. Yes. Yeah. No, it sounds good, though.
It does sound good, and it's part of a great initiative. This Global Religion Research Initiative is a large initiative which is giving funding for postdocs and book projects and curriculum development. So anyone who's listening, there is another round for that. So people at Berkeley should apply and get funded.
Sounds good.
So immediately, the very short term is a long road trip across the I-90 because
that also sounds
writing
good.
A dissertation takes it out of you. You need a break. So I'm going to take a long trip over to Indiana. And,
any pre-planned stops or played by ear?
Along Yellowstone, Cody. I hear the largest gun, or one of the largest gun museums in the country is in Cody, Wyoming. It just feels like something, if you're going by it, you should see.
Yes.
So once I get to Notre Dame, the plan is to first start thinking about the dissertation as a book, and I think this ties to another question you had asked: why British strategic culture? That's the focus for the dissertation. The idea for the book is to make it both more policy relevant and more contemporary by adding a chapter on American involvement in Iraq or Afghanistan, both depending on who I can speak to and what information is available. But I think it would be helpful to show that the biases that I spell out in the dissertation apply in a more contemporary context. I think it would be especially important given that we have more intelligence, we have better intelligence capabilities now. So to show that really is that even with more information, we still have this bias. Would I think be powerful for the argument, interesting for the reader who wants, let's be honest, wants to read about these conflicts, and just show the broader reach of the claim. So that's one thing that I'll be doing at Notre Dame.
That seems like plenty.
That's the main, right? So ideally, it's a really, it's a great opportunity to have 2 years. So many postdocs are 1 year. So I do feel particularly grateful for this 2 years to really be able to think about the manuscript. I would like to go back to the archives as well to sort of clean up or look further into some of the documents that I didn't include in the dissertation because I wasn't exactly sure if they're pointing to parts of the argument that I think they are.
Is this always in Britain?
So this
British
would be
archives?
So initially the research was in Britain, Cyprus, and Israel, and it was a grant from the Berkeley Center for the Study of Religion that really helped with a large portion of that research, and enabled me to go back to London for a summer and do the sort of initial, to do more data collection, but also initial review of things that I had identified as particularly helpful. So it made the dissertation possible, right?
Excellent.
So it'd be nice to go back and know that there are very select files that I would look at more carefully now. So I think that's part of it. I think just going back to London is fine because the majority of documents from these conflicts are there. So it's going to be a big part of it. And then beyond that, trying to push forward because 2 years means 2 years on the job market as well, right? So I would like to get the rebel group fragmentation paper done and out. And then with a postdoc currently at Berkeley, we've been talking about, we're interested in Islamist governance in cities. So if you think about ISIS, but this is a colleague who spent some time in Mali, who was able to talk to people who, in 2015, who had been under some of the occupied cities in northern Mali. So that's on the horizon too. We're really interested in, again, pushing past the conventional wisdom. We think of ISIS cutting people's hands off and doing this and that, and really they're, like most rebel groups, concerned with basic governance, basic order, and so we're interested in how they govern, let's say, like standard insurgencies with a twist. Right? That maybe they choose to do in a slightly different way, or they focus on different topics. So that's how I'll spend a lot of time in South Bend.
That also sounds ambitious and exciting in a lot of ways. Do you, if I can segue again, how do you see such projects fitting into religious studies in the next 10 years? Is this going to be a typical project? Are you an outlier? What do you see happening?
Well, I hope, was sort of what I said earlier about the background and the projects I'm working on now. I just really love the study of religion. I find it to be one of the most fascinating topics, only on par with studying conflict. And I feel so fortunate that I can do the two together, and I'm not sure why people study other things, even though I understand they're important. Broadly, like, so where I hope my research is going in the direction of where some of the field will also go, and that is, I use this phrase a lot, conventional wisdom, pushing us past what we think we know about religion, particularly religious conflict. There is just too many studies that confirm suspicions we have with specious data. That I think we need to think more theoretically. So I think one reason people gravitate towards the conventional view of religion and conflict is that we have theories to explain religious violence that are intuitive and that people latch onto rather easily. When I first started talking about this idea that religious groups might fragment more, people might feel very suspicious. But you talk to someone in religious studies and you mention the word schism, and they go, yep, that sounds right. Right? And so I think there needs to be, you can leverage the strengths of this interdisciplinary approach to ask broader questions, develop things more theoretically, and then find, I think what my work does is try to find data that allows us to reasonably test it. There could be a tendency to focus on data-driven research in the study of religion, which I hope we don't go in that direction. I think data-driven research can be helpful to answer particular questions, but it can really limit what we ask. And I think the study, particularly in political science of religion, is so fresh that we need to be asking big, broad questions that challenge us to see the world differently than we think it is.
So you really do see an importance in interdisciplinary work. I believe in a previous conversation between us, you'd mentioned you still felt there's some silos among the disciplines, and it's somewhat hard to bridge those. This might be, again, a good transition to our last question. Thinking about interdisciplinarity in particular, some of the silos you've seen, for a young graduate student or even an undergraduate who might want to do some work on religion in the future, what advice would you have, both practical, theoretical, big picture? Are there specific tools that should be used, conferences attended, approaches, attitudes, etc.? What advice would you have?
So it's a humbling question, given that just finished.
I know,
I need to advise.
Now you're a doctor, Jason Klocek.
Exactly. I would give advice that I think builds on what we've talked about for the last 20 minutes or so. That one, think about your past and your history. It inevitably directs you to certain questions. So when students ask me, particularly undergraduates, should I go to graduate school? I often ask, what is your driving question? What's the thing you can't go without understanding? And if you don't have an answer to that, I think there are many other wonderful things you can do.
Sure.
But 7, 8, 9 years in a graduate program may not be for you, right? So think about what really interests you about the world. And then think about where you could answer that best. So in terms of discipline, I talked about that a lot, but really emphasizing this interdisciplinary side of it. I would not be a good scholar of religion in political science if I only read political scientists. And so while at Berkeley, I've taken advantage of talks and other opportunities at the Graduate Theological Union, here at the Berkeley Center for the Study of Religion, other talks, so Near Eastern Studies will do talks, policy-wise, Institute for International Studies. So think broadly. Don't think, I think sometimes for graduate students, we are increasingly thinking in terms of output and career. So we're thinking, what is this network of scholars I need to know well to get me to my next step? If that's how you think about interdisciplinary research, you're not going to branch out more broadly. So other conferences, so someone in religious studies might think about going to the International Studies Association conference, which I go to annually, because there's a broad range of topics there, particularly in critical theory. I went to McGill University in March for a conference on religion and violence, and I was the only political scientist there. It was mostly the humanities were represented, and I think that's incredibly valuable because you get that exchange. So don't think so much, think about your professional network, but also think about the ideas that you want. So yeah, find things that you're really interested in exploring, that you really want to know, that aren't just trendy for you. And then find broad networks where you can encounter ways of looking at religion that you hadn't thought about. So in the end, that's the most interesting. That's why I keep coming back to study religion. Every time you think you have it figured out, there's another
something
angle.
else. Anything else?
I think it's a good place to leave it.
Okay, great. Jason, thank you so much for taking the time. Again, Jason Klocek just finished his PhD in political science at UC Berkeley. His dissertation is entitled The Cult of Coercion, Religion and Strategic Culture in British Counterinsurgency. We'll supply a link to Jason's website where you can read abstracts on his dissertation, his working papers, his published articles. And Jason is headed to Notre Dame, where he'll be a 2018-2020 Global Religion Research Initiative Postdoctoral Fellow. Jason, again, thank you.
Thank you very much.